Hello, my name is Joel Fernandez, and today I am going to talk about First Nations, Inuit, and Metis. First Nations, Inuit, and Metis are complex and diverse communities with rich cultural traditions that have been passed down for generations. First Nations people are the Indigenous peoples of Canada who are neither Inuit nor Metis. Inuit peoples are Indigenous peoples in Canada's Arctic regions and parts of Greenland, Alaska, and Russia. Metis people are a distinct Indigenous people with a unique culture, language, and history that evolved through a fusion of First Nations and European cultures. Each of these communities has its own unique history, culture, and traditions. Learning about them can help us better understand and appreciate the diversity of Indigenous peoples in Canada. It is important to recognize that Indigenous peoples in Canada have experienced significant trauma and oppression throughout history and continue to face systemic barriers today. By learning about their cultures and histories, we can work towards reconciliation and healing. Introduction to Indigenous peoples. First Nations, Inuit, Metis. Challenges facing Indigenous peoples. Celebrating Indigenous cultures. Indigenous peoples are the original inhabitants of a particular region or country. In Canada, there are three main groups of Indigenous peoples: First Nations, Inuit, and Metis. These groups have unique cultures, languages, and traditions that have been shaped by their relationships with the land and their experiences with colonization and assimilation. First Nations peoples are the Indigenous peoples in Canada who are not Inuit or Metis. There are over 600 First Nations communities across Canada, each with their own distinct culture and language. Historically, First Nations peoples were semi-nomadic, moving from place to place depending on the seasons and the availability of resources. Today, many First Nations peoples live on reserves, which are areas of land set aside for them by the Canadian government. The Inuit are Indigenous peoples who live in the Arctic regions of Canada, Greenland, and Alaska. They have a unique culture that is adapted to the harsh conditions of the north. Traditionally, the Inuit were skilled hunters and fishermen, relying on the land and sea for their survival. Today, many Inuit still practice these traditional ways of life, while also adapting to modern society. The Metis are Indigenous peoples who are of mixed European and Indigenous ancestry. They have a unique culture that combines elements of both Indigenous and European traditions. The Metis emerged as a distinct group in the 18th century as a result of intermarriage between French fur traders and Indigenous women. Today, many Metis live in Western Canada, particularly in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. Indigenous peoples in Canada have faced many challenges throughout history, including forced assimilation, residential schools, and loss of land and resources. Today, Indigenous peoples continue to face systemic racism, poverty, and social inequality. However, there are also many Indigenous-led initiatives and movements aimed at addressing these issues and promoting reconciliation. Despite the challenges they have faced, Indigenous peoples in Canada have rich and vibrant cultures that are worth celebrating and preserving. There are many ways to support Indigenous peoples and learn more about their cultures, such as attending powwows, visiting Indigenous-owned businesses, and reading Indigenous literature.